I opened my electric bill and felt my blood run cold. $450, triple my usual amount. And then I saw it Deborah Harrington next door, charging her Tesla off my electricity. I watched her sneak across my yard at 2 a.m., plugging in that damn car with a smile on her face. But here's the kicker. My smart power system caught her in the act, and how it turned her $90,000 Tesla into nothing more than a fancy paperweight. Well, that's where this story gets real good. Stick around to find out what happened next, because she never saw it coming. Deborah Harrington had that kind of presence you couldn't ignore. When she moved in next door to me in Pinewood Estates, she seemed to be on a mission, and I quickly became her target. Everything about her screamed entitlement, from her designer yoga pants to the polished arrogance in her voice. She didn't just want to fit in. She wanted to control the entire neighborhood. It didn't take long for her to make her move. Within weeks, Deborah had wormed her way onto the HOA board, despite being a complete newcomer. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I started noticing her subtle manipulations. She hosted overpriced dinner parties, dropped names like they were hot potatoes, and used her charm to get what she wanted. It was all part of her plan, and I had unknowingly walked right into her web. But it wasn't just about making the neighborhood her personal kingdom. No, Deborah wasn't content with just power. She wanted something more. She wanted everything, and that included my electricity. After all, what was a little free power for her shiny Tesla if she could get away with it? As her reign grew stronger, so did her boldness. She had no problem stepping on anyone to get ahead, and soon I was the one in her sights. I never expected much from suburban life, but Pinewood Estates was supposed to be a fresh start. I'd just come out of a quiet divorce, and the last thing I wanted was drama. I'd always been more of a keep-to-yourself guy. My job as an electrical engineer allowed me to work from home, and the peaceful routine of my new bachelor life was everything I needed. There were community barbecues and the summer neighbors who waved as they passed a simple, easy life. The house itself wasn't much, but it was mine. It had a nice, quiet yard, a modest 3-bedroom setup, and an old oak tree that shaded the front porch. It was perfect for someone who just needed to reset, but I should have known better. Sometimes even the nicest places have their own storms, and Deborah Harrington was about to make landfall. When I first met her, I went over to her place with a welcome basket, some local craft beer chocolates, and neighborhood info. She smiled at me, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was dressed head to toe in designer clothes that screamed, "Look at me." She invited me in for a tour of her house, and the entire place was a monument to excess. Italian marble countertops, custom lighting, and chandeliers that probably cost more than my entire living room. Every room felt like it was built to impress, not to live in. Her husband William was barely home, and when he was as cold and distant as the marble floors. Deborah, on the other hand, was all charm and calculated precision. She'd already begun to plant the seeds of her HOA takeover, hosting fancy dinner parties, complimenting the right people, and slipping threats wrapped in kindness. It didn't take long before I realized she wasn't just here to live, she was here to control. At first I brushed it off. HOA politics, I didn't care about that. But when my electric bill spiked and Deborah's Tesla appeared parked by my fence, I realized things were about to get a lot more complicated. It started small, almost too small to notice. I'd come home from work one afternoon to find a note wedged under my door. Reminder: lawn edges must be trimmed to HOA standards. Violation notice pending. I had been out of town for work and the lawn had grown a bit wild, but the note felt off. The handwriting wasn't on official letterhead, and there was no signature, just a threat. It wasn't the first time I'd seen something like this, but it was the first time it was so personal. I brushed it off thinking it was a coincidence. But then came another notice, this one, about my unapproved lockbox over the outdoor outlet. The lockbox was a precaution, a way to prevent anyone from using my electricity without permission. Funny how no one had mentioned it before Deborah moved in. Still, I was getting paranoid. But this wasn't the worst of it. No, that came later when I noticed Deborah standing in front of my house at 2 a.m. glancing over at my electrical meter. I couldn't prove anything, but it felt like she was watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike. A few nights later, I was woken up by a notification from my security cameras. I checked my phone and saw a figure moving across my backyard. It was Deborah dressed in her silk robe and pajamas, sneaking through the bushes like some kind of electricity-stealing ninja. She was carrying a long extension cord. At first I thought I was seeing things, but when I replayed the footage there, she was plugging her car into my outlet. The cord snaked its way along our shared fence, disappearing into the side of her property. I couldn't believe it. I watched her for a few more minutes, just to make sure. After she finished, she turned and walked back into her house, leaving me to fume in silence. The next morning, I marched over to her house phone in hand with the video queued up. I knocked, and when she answered, she was all smiles until I showed her the footage. Her face turned to stone. "That could be anyone," she said, brushing it off. "And honestly, if your electrical system is causing such high bills, maybe you should consider upgrading. We all want to keep our property values up, don't we?" Her dismissive tone made me boil. The nerve. She was using my electricity, and now she was making it sound like it was my fault. And then came the threat: if I didn't fix my hedges, she'd report me to the HOA. As if the little overgrown shrubs in front of my house were the real issue. I wasn't having it anymore. I installed additional security cameras around my property and put lock boxes on my outdoor outlets. It wasn't just about the money, it was about principle. But within 48 hours, the HOA hit me with another violation notice for the lock boxes. According to the letter, I had made unauthorized modifications to my property. It was signed by Gregory Palmer, the HOA inspector, but I knew this was Deborah's doing. Gregory showed up the next day to ensure compliance. I tried explaining the situation, but he wouldn't listen. "This is a private dispute between neighbors," he said, dismissing my claims. When I tried to show him the footage of Deborah stealing my power, he wouldn't even look at it. His only concern was that my lockboxes violated HOA guidelines. He had a big smile on his face as he watched me reluctantly remove them under his watchful eye. It was clear Deborah was pulling the strings. That weekend, I decided to attend the HOA meeting for the first time. I walked into the clubhouse and found about 30 neighbors sitting in uncomfortable folding chairs, the smell of stale coffee in the air. When the floor opened for resident concerns, I raised my hand. I had my documentation in hand, ready to present everything: the footage, the bills, the lockboxes. I was about to make my case when Deborah shot up from her seat, cutting me off. "Point of order," she called out. "Personal disputes should not be discussed at the general meeting. They must be submitted in writing to the board first." The HOA president Frank nodded, backing her up. Yes, procedure must be followed," he muttered, his balding head glistening under the fluorescent lights. Frustrated, I sat back down. Deborah gave me a smug smile from her seat at the board table. The meeting continued as if nothing had happened, and I was forced to submit my complaint in writing, which Deborah knew would delay any real action. It was becoming clear she had the board in her pocket. But then Deborah hit me with the real bombshell, her proposal for a community-wide Tesla charging station. "Green energy," she said, with a saccharine smile. "It's the future." I realized what was going on. This wasn't just about me. She had convinced the HOA to fund these stations with our dues. And one of those charging stations was being planned for the parking lot right next to my property. She was going to get everyone in the neighborhood to pay for her electric car, and they didn't even know it. I knew I couldn't let this go. I spent weeks researching HOA laws, local regulations, and electrical codes. My background in engineering meant I was good at finding loopholes, and I found plenty. What Deborah didn't know was that her reign of power was about to come to a crashing halt. I started gathering evidence. I installed a power monitoring device on my electrical panel to track exactly how much electricity Deborah was stealing from me. The results were staggering. She was drawing an average of 75 kilowatt hours a night. At local rates, that added up to hundreds of dollars a month, and she wasn't just using my electricity anymore. She was using the entire community's power. With the next HOA meeting around the corner, I felt ready. I had all the data, all the footage, and all the signatures from my neighbors who were just as pissed off as I was. The moment Deborah presented her charging station proposal, I'd be ready to expose her. But what I didn't expect was just how far Deborah was willing to go. That night, I received a notification from my cameras. Deborah was outside again this time, not just on her property, but near the community outlets. My worst fears were coming true. She was testing the new outlets before they were even installed. It was game on. The morning after I installed the Smart Power Protection System SPS, I felt a mix of excitement and tension. The system was in place, the warnings were clear, and I knew this was the moment of truth. I'd set it up to monitor the power usage closely, with built-in warnings that would trigger if anyone tried to use the electricity improperly, specifically Deborah, who had been skirting the line for months. I knew she wouldn't back down easily. That night, as I watched the security cameras from my kitchen window, I saw her. Deborah was outside again, strutting across her lawn in her typical silk robe, her oversized sunglasses perched on her head. She was headed straight for the community outlet near my property, the one I'd been monitoring. I wasn't surprised, after all. I'd been waiting for her to try something. What I hadn't anticipated was her blatant defiance. As I watched through the cameras, she approached the outlet, plugged in her Tesla, and set the charging rate to its maximum. She didn't even look at the warning sign I'd so carefully placed the flashing LED, the bold, authorized use only message, clearly visible. No, she smirked and fiddled with her car, completely ignoring the blinking yellow warning light that signaled an abnormal power draw. The system kicked into gear just as it was supposed to. The first warning light blinked in sequence, accompanied by a low beep. Then when she didn't back off, the system triggered a second warning. I could almost hear her thinking, "It's just a warning. What's the worst that could happen?" She cranked up the charge rate even more. That's when the SPS kicked into overdrive. I'd programmed it to detect dangerous surges, and after 2 warnings, it began the safety procedure, a controlled voltage fluctuation. The power dropped, and I could see on my system's monitor that the power to her car had been cut. The system wasn't built to damage anything, but it was designed to make sure no one, especially not Deborah, could exploit it further. Seconds later, my phone buzzed with a new notification. Deborah was pacing in front of her car, furiously checking her Tesla's screen, her face twisting into a mask of confusion and anger. I could almost hear her thoughts. What just happened? She stood still for a moment, then slammed her hand against the car's dashboard, muttering something under her breath. Her face turned red, and she glanced up as if suddenly aware she was being watched. I wasn't just watching from my window anymore. I had her on camera. Deborah marched toward my house, rage burning in her eyes. She didn't bother with pleasantries this time. "You've destroyed my car!" she spat when I opened the door. Her voice was sharp, filled with venom. "You've bricked my Tesla. Do you have any idea what this will cost me? $22,000 to fix this, and it's all your fault?" I stood there, calm coffee mug in hand, letting her words hang in the air. "Actually, Deborah, it was your fault. The system worked exactly as designed. You ignored the warnings, increased the charge rate, and that caused the surge that fried your car's battery management system." Her face twitched, and she took a step back, eyes wide. "You can't prove it was me," she sneered, but I wasn't backing down. "I have video footage, Deborah. I have everything from your midnight charging attempts to the footage of you bypassing every warning signal. You knew exactly what you were doing." The doorbell rang just as I finished speaking, and I turned to see William, her husband, pulling up in his sleek black Mercedes. He stepped out, phone still pressed to his ear, and walked up to the porch with a frustrated look on his face. "Ethan," he said, holding up a hand to quiet Deborah, who was still fuming. "Let's calm down. You've made your point. Let's talk this out, okay?" "No, William," I said, my tone even but firm. "This isn't a misunderstanding. You know exactly what's been going on, and now your wife's actions have consequences. Her use of my electricity, and now the HOA's complicity, has caused significant harm to my wallet, to the neighborhood. If you want to talk about damage, let's start with the $7,000 your wife owes for the power she's been stealing from all of us." William stared at the documents I handed him, his face changing from annoyance to realization. He glanced at Deborah, who had gone quiet, her fists clenched by her sides. "You've been using the HOA's resources for your own benefit," I continued. "The new outlets, the community charging stations, it's all been set up to benefit you, Deborah. It's time for the community to see the truth. And I have the evidence to back it up." William didn't say a word. Instead, he turned to Deborah, his expression hardening. He muttered something to her, but I couldn't make out the words. What I did hear was the sound of the flatbed tow truck in the distance, ready to take her precious Tesla away. The next morning, Deborah's Tesla was gone. The flatbed tow truck had hauled it off to the service center, and Deborah stood in front of her house, eyes burning with fury, as she watched it drive away. Her perfect car, the one she'd flaunted so proudly, was now rendered useless, a $90,000 paperweight. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her entitlement had led her to think she could take whatever she wanted, but in the end, it was her greed that cost her. A few hours later, a letter arrived, a formal HOA notice calling for a special meeting. It wasn't just about the charges I'd exposed, though. The letter included a request for a full audit of Deborah's activities during her time on the board, especially the questionable financial decisions surrounding the charging stations. The board was starting to crack under the weight of the truth, and Deborah knew it. I didn't waste any time. I spent the next few hours organizing everything: video footage, the power consumption data, the calculations of how much Deborah's personal theft had cost the neighborhood. And of course, I had the detailed technical documentation on the smart power protection system, the one that had turned her prized Tesla into a glorified paperweight. The evidence was undeniable. Deborah had crossed every line, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. The meeting at the community clubhouse was a spectacle. Frank, the HOA president, was already visibly sweating as he set up the projector. He had no idea how this meeting was going to go. His nervous twitching was only interrupted when Martha, the 68-year-old widow from 2 doors down, arrived early with a stack of documents neatly organized in military precision. Her sly smile told me everything I needed to know. She'd been preparing for this showdown long before I even had the idea to fight back. By the time the meeting began, the room was packed. Neighbors who had once barely exchanged casual hellos now filled the seats, whispering in groups. Deborah was sitting at the front, dressed in her signature high-end outfit, arms crossed tightly as she glared at me. William was conspicuously absent, but Deborah didn't need him. She was the one calling the shots, or so she thought. As Frank called the meeting to order, his voice cracked slightly, a clear sign of how uncomfortable he was. I stood up, ready to present. I'd like to address the recent concerns regarding the misuse of community electricity. I began, my voice calm and steady. The projector flickered to life, and I began to methodically present everything I had gathered: the videos, the power usage data, the increase in HOA fees coinciding with Deborah's car charging habits. The room grew quiet as I displayed graphs and charts showing how Deborah's actions had affected everyone's bills. The more I spoke, the more people began to understand just how deeply they'd been taken advantage of. I even showed footage of Deborah not only stealing electricity from me, but deliberately bypassing all the warnings with a smirk on her face. Deborah shot to her feet, shouting over me, "This is character assassination. He's been spying on me, harassing me, and now he's trying to ruin my reputation." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Brian Thompson, the local high school teacher, stood up and spoke quietly, but the emotion in his voice carried weight. "My family has been struggling with the HOA fees for months. I had to pull my son out of his baseball league because we couldn't afford the equipment. Now we find out we've been paying for her electricity." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. One by one, neighbors stood up, recounting how their bills had gone up and how they too had felt the financial strain. It was a tipping point. Deborah's influence was starting to crumble. She wasn't the golden girl anymore. She was the thief, and everyone could see it. Enough, Deborah snapped, but her voice was now weak, desperate. "This is ridiculous. You can't do this." Martha, always the strategist, stood up next, a small stack of documents in hand. "I move that we immediately vote to remove Deborah Harrington from the board and require full restitution of the funds she misappropriated. We will also call for a new election for all board positions." The motion was seconded by several people, and the vote was quick. Deborah was ousted from the HOA board with overwhelming support from the community. Her reign of manipulation had come to an end. The results were immediate. Deborah was forced to pay restitution in about $7,000 to cover the stolen electricity, and the board began planning the installation of individual metering for the community's charging stations, ensuring no one would have to foot the bill for another resident's car. The entire community seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief as the toxic influence of Deborah and her husband began to evaporate. 2 weeks later, Deborah and William put their house on the market. They listed it well below market value for a quick sale. No one in the neighborhood was surprised. They'd overstayed their welcome, and now the truth was out. When the moving truck pulled up outside their house, the neighbors didn't gather to help. The only person who was there was Martha, who sat across the street in her lawn chair, sipping tea and occasionally raising her cup in a mock toast whenever Deborah looked her way. It was petty, but it felt satisfying. In the months that followed, Pinewood Estates slowly returned to normal. The HOA's financial practices were revamped, and a new board led by Brian Thompson was put in place. Transparency became the foundation, and everyone knew where their dues were going. The charging stations designed by yours truly were installed with individual meters, ensuring that everyone paid their fair share. The Thompson's son rejoined his baseball league, and the neighborhood became a stronger, more united place. Martha started a community garden, turning an unused space into a vibrant, productive area. And as for me, I declined an offer to join the new HOA board. I had no interest in that kind of politics. But I did agree to serve as the community's technical advisor for security and energy systems. As for Deborah, her departure was swift and quiet. She and William moved to a gated community far away, where I imagined the electrical outlets were probably well guarded by HOA rules and privileged residents. Every time I drive past the spot where Deborah used to park her Tesla, I can't help but smile. The charging station that replaced it now stands proudly, a reminder of how a little knowledge and a lot of patience can turn the tables on those who think they can take what isn't theirs. Martha had a saying, "Karma doesn't need Wi-Fi to connect to people who deserve it." And she was right.